All right, let's talk about pest control methods. So we're going to talk about traditional pest control, and we're going to talk about some more sustainable versions of pest control. So let's take a quick look at our um, PowerPoint here. Okay, there we go. All right, so um, pest control is something that you've probably had some experience with in your own home. Um, Certainly, it is something that we've talked about at school in terms of kind of pests that are more related to viruses and infection. Um, so, why do we use pesticides? And pesticides is the broad term, and we're going to talk about what all that includes. But why do we use pesticides? Because pests can cause a lot of damage to crops, and so it helps to decrease damage. It also helps to increase yield. Sometimes, even it's just because it makes a prettier product. So, in this picture here, we're looking at a tomato that has had damage from a stink bug or a leaf-footed bug, and it doesn't actually harm the tomato. It's still just as edible, but it's not pretty, and people aren't likely to buy it. Um, so, who uses pesticides? Well, it turns out that the US is the primary consumer of pesticides. We in the US use 1/3 of the pesticides world over. So, we use a huge quantity of pesticides, and part of that has to do with our usage of genetically modified organisms because we have specifically bred organisms or created organisms that are resistant to some of our pesticides, specifically things like um, weed killers, so that we can spray it directly on our crops. So that's one of the reasons that we use more pesticides than anyone else. And this is a map of the pesticides applied by watershed. And this dark purple burgundy color is actually means that it is the most. So top 100 watersheds. And you'll notice that we here are in the top 200 watersheds for pounds of pesticides applied. And you'll notice that those areas where you have lots of agriculture tend to be pretty high in the amount of pesticide applied. This is what we call the Valley of California, and that's where a huge amount of crops are grown in the United States. And so you can see that the number of crops grown definitely correlates with the amount of pesticide that's applied. Okay, so what is a pesticide? So we can talk about broad scale pesticides. Those have a lot of applications. And then we can start talking about more specific pesticides. And so that would be things like herbicides. Herbicides kill plants. The idea is that you want to kill the competing plant species. There are also fungicides. So fungicides attack fungal problems. Most of the time you use these in home gardens or on ornamental plants as well. And then we have rodenticides. So those are things that kill rodents. So things like rabbits and moles and voles and gophers, things that damage crops. And then you have all your other insecticides, and those might be targeted at specific insects. So your broad scale pesticides frequently have both an insecticide and an herbicide in them. They might be just one or the other. Okay. What are the drawbacks of using pesticides? So we've talked about the advantages of them. They increase productivity, they decrease damage. Drawbacks, well, they generally are not specific, they're not targeted. So they're going to kill any animal, any insect that lands on that plant. And so when you're killing those non-target species, you might be killing beneficial insects. Those might be predators of the particular pest that you're trying to get rid of. In the case of a ladybug, they might be pollinators in the case of bees. They might be our nitrogen fixing bacteria that we need in order to fix the nitrogen in the soil in order for the plant to grow. So that's one of our major drawbacks, is that they kill broad groups of insects. Not all of them are pests. Then we have this idea of bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation means that over time, as these animals eat more and more of the contaminated food, and over time it doesn't get eliminated from their bodies. That's bioaccumulation. When we talk about biomagnification, we're talking about the idea that a low level of contamination, low in the trophic level, is going to be, as you move up through the trophic chain, each subsequent consumer is going to have higher and higher percentages of that contaminant in their body because they're eating so much of that lower trophic level in order to survive. So bioaccumulation is the idea that over time that pesticide accumulates in the body of the organism. And biomagnification is the idea that as we move up through the trophic chain, the amount of contaminant in each animal gets higher. And so when we talk about bald eagles are a great example of bioaccumulation and biomagnification because they're at the top of the food chain. And so they were eating animals that had had high levels of bioaccumulation, and then that caused biomagnification in the eagles. And it turns out that DDT, which was one of the primary insecticides at the time, actually causes the eggs of the bald eagle to not be able to withstand the weight of the nesting mother. And so these eagles were laying eggs, and then as the mothers were trying to sit on the nests and keep them warm, they were actually breaking the eggs. And so that caused a huge drop in the population of eagles because they weren't able to reproduce. So another significant environmental drawback is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Then we have this idea of natural selection and resistance. So this actually is a case where natural selection is a case of artificial selection for something we don't want. So as we have insects and we apply a pesticide, the only insects that are going to survive are those that are naturally resistant to that particular pesticide. Well, those, because they survive, are able to reproduce. And so their offspring are likely to be resistant to that pesticide as well. And then their offspring are going to be resistant. And so we get onto something that we call the pesticide treadmill, where we're having to add higher and higher and develop new and different forms of pesticide because the population, we are selecting for the organisms that are resistant to the pesticide that we're using. And then another major drawback is the pollution of groundwater because these pesticides get into the water, they percolate down through the soil, and they join the groundwater. And so our groundwater is actually contaminated with a lot of pesticides. There's also pollution through what we call drift. So this is that when we apply a pesticide, because of air movement, that it can actually also wind up in other areas, even without being carried by water. And then the last major drawback of insecticides is that they can actually be toxic to us as well. And you guys might know that there have been several cases recently where Monsanto, which is the manufacturer of glyphosate, also known as Roundup, has been sued because it turns out that it is a major cause of cancer in field workers who have applied that glyphosate. So these can be significant, like cancer. They can be smaller effects, like gastro distress. They can actually cause an imbalance in our gut because it kills off beneficial bacteria for us. They can cause headaches. They can cause fatigue. So there's a lot of issues that can be caused by pesticides in humans. So what's the alternative? We don't want to give up on farming. We need food. So how can we address this in a more sustainable way and in a way that causes less damage to the environment? And so that's where we start to talk about this idea of integrated pest management. So integrated pest management combines several different methods to effectively control our pest species, but at the same time, minimize the disruption to the environment. And so there tend to be 4 components to integrated pest management. Number one is monitoring. So you really need to know what the pests are in order to know how to appropriately address them. Number two is preventative measures, which can include cultural practices. Number three would be biological agents. And number four would be chemical controls. So integrated pest management does not remove pesticides from the equation. It just uses them sparingly and sort of as a last resort or as a small piece of an overall system. So let's talk about that system. So the biggest thing is what we call cultural. So that would be having good sanitation, not leaving waste in the field that could then create a home for pests. It's also habitat change, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Physical and mechanical. Now, if we're talking about crops, we're talking about physical barriers or mechanical barriers. So this is why a lot of the time when you drive by crops, you'll see plastic on the ground. Or maybe when you guys help with the garden at home, you might apply a landscaping fabric. So that's a physical barrier to pests. Then we can talk about biological being a component of it. These are things like parasites that cause damage to the pest or predators that eat the pest. And then the last and smallest piece, but still very significant piece of integrated pest management is the chemical component. And that might be things like oils or things like diatomaceous earth, so things that are repellent, or it could be a conventional pesticide that kills on contact. So let's talk about that first piece, and that is the cultural piece. So that's good sanitation, and that is providing habitat changes. And so a big piece of this is crop rotation and or intercropping. And so you plan and plant in a rotation. And what happens here is that if you do get an infestation, so let's say that you grow peppers, which are in the nightshade family, you might have some bacteria left over in the soil or some fungus left over in the soil that like that nightshade family. But then when you grow something from the coal family in the next year, it's not a host for that particular pest. And so it's not bothered by that pest. And then in that third year, as you've prepared the soil, then you grow those crops that are very sensitive to weeds. And so you have this rotation that helps to reduce pests. We can also use pest-resistant varieties. These would be naturally occurring pest-resistant varieties. And we have kind of two different variations of pest-resistant varieties. You might have one that's considered resistant. That means that the pests actually don't like it and they stay away from it. Or you might have one that's tolerant. And what that means is that it can have a certain number of pests and it's not going to affect the productivity of the plant. Of course, if you have a susceptible plant, then it is going to be damaged by the presence of the bugs. We also can talk about physical barriers. And again, that would be things like going through and removing, physically pulling weeds. It can also be barriers like landscaping fabric or plastic to prevent the growth of the weeds in the first place. Another big piece is the biological piece. So this might be creating habitats for predators of our pests. So if you're growing bananas, you want to create a habitat that's desirable for these predators so that they come along and they eliminate the pests for you. Growing apples, you want a different set. And so again, you're going to create a different environment, but you're still trying to create a habitat that draws in these protective species, these predators that will then protect your species from pests. And then of course, the last piece is those chemical controls, okay? This does not mean no pesticides. This does not mean organic. It just means that they are simply one piece out of the entire toolkit that's being used to protect your crops from pests. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.